Access denied. Access denied.
Imagine your freedom decided not by a jury of your peers, but by a line of code you will never see. A computer program locked inside a corporate vault, protected as a trade secret. No transparency, no accountability, just numbers on a screen, numbers that could mean life in prison. This isn't science fiction. This is today's courtroom reality. And thousands of lives may already have been condemned by the algorithm. But what if the software was wrong? What if the code was flawed? This is Innocence Uncovered. We expose the corrupt systems that destroy lives. If you believe in true justice, hit subscribe. The deep dive starts now. It started, like so many courtroom thrillers, with a crime unsolved. A brutal assault in Pennsylvania had gone cold for nearly a decade. The evidence sat in storage, dusty envelopes containing a tiny smear of biological material, too mixed and degraded for traditional forensic labs to make sense of. For years, detectives hit dead end after dead end, until a prosecutor whispered two words that would change everything. TrueAllele software. Created by a Pittsburgh-based company called Cybergenetics, TrueAllele promised something extraordinary. Using complex computational algorithms, it could take a messy DNA mixture, samples with multiple contributors, contamination, even degradation, and untangle it with mathematical precision. Where human analysts saw chaos, the machine saw clarity. And in this case, the machine gave clarity with stunning authority. A single name emerged from the statistical soup. A suspect. A match. The jury was shown not hesitation, not uncertainty, but a probability figure so high, it seemed like destiny. 99.9999% in T, 720. Certainty. The message was clear, the computer doesn't lie. The suspect was convicted. Justice, at least in the eyes of the state, was served. But what the jury didn't know was that nobody, not the defense, not even independent scientists, had ever been allowed to see how that number was created. The source code behind TrueAllele was locked away, protected by Cybergenetics as intellectual property. The defense asked to review it. They were denied. Prosecutors argued it was a trade secret. So the man was sent to prison on the word of a machine that nobody could question. And that was just the beginning. In the hushed silence of a courtroom, numbers hold a power greater than words. A prosecutor rises to their feet. They don't speak of eyewitnesses or unreliable memories. Instead, they show the jury a screen. On it, a simple statistic glows. 99.99% probability this DNA matches the defendant. No human testimony could ever be that certain. No cross-examination could shake a number so absolute. And that's the seduction of computational forensics. Programs like TrueAllele and STRMix have been marketed as miracle machines, software that can decode the tiniest, most degraded fragments of DNA and transform them into courtroom convictions. To jurors, it sounds like science fiction. To prosecutors, it's the ultimate weapon, irrefutable proof, wrapped in the language of mathematics. But what the jury doesn't hear is how those numbers are generated. The companies behind these programs, like Cybergenetics, which makes TrueAllele, describe their systems as cutting-edge, rigorously tested, and objective. They tell courts that the software runs millions of complex calculations, far beyond human capacity, to separate truth from noise. And in glossy presentations, they repeat the same promise. The computer doesn't lie. But ask any statistician, and you'll hear a different truth. A computer only tells you what it was programmed to say. And in this case, no one outside those companies is allowed to see how it works. When defense attorneys ask for the source code, they're told it's a trade secret. When independent scientists demand transparency, they're blocked. And when a jury sees the results, they're delivered as fact. Not possibility, not interpretation, but fact. That is how the aura of infallibility is built. Prosecutors lean into it, judges defer to it, and juries are left with a simple, devastating thought. How could a computer be wrong? But here's the terrifying truth. Computers are wrong all the time. From planes to hospitals, from Wall Street to your phone, technology fails. And when it does, the consequences are catastrophic. So why, in a courtroom, the one place where human freedom is on the line, do we suspend our skepticism? Why do we treat an algorithm's voice as gospel? Because that's exactly how the system has trained us to see it. The algorithm isn't presented as evidence. It's presented as truth itself. And every time a jury convicts based on that faith, the software gains more power and more secrecy. But the first cracks in this facade would appear sooner than anyone expected. Because one defense team dared to ask the forbidden question, what's inside the black box? And what they found would unravel everything. Why do juries trust a machine more than a man? The answer lies in the psychology of numbers. When a witness takes the stand, the jury sees human flaws, hesitation, emotion, contradictions under pressure. But when a computer delivers a probability, 99.99% match, it feels absolute, clean, cold, certain. And in a courtroom, certainty is everything. For decades, courts have struggled with the fallibility of eyewitnesses, the unreliability of informants, the biases of police. But DNA was different. DNA arrived in the 1990s as the gold standard. Unshakable, revolutionary. And when DNA evidence seemed unclear, software like TrueAllele and STRMix promised a new frontier to make the ambiguous definitive, to pull clarity from the chaos. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was the voice of science. But here's the catch. When science is turned into software, it becomes whatever the programmer says it is. Prosecutors rarely explain how the algorithm works. They don't have to. Instead, they lean into the illusion. They say things like, the computer analyzed the data without bias. Or, the program ran millions of simulations, far more than any human could. Statements designed to dazzle, to overwhelm, to silence doubt. And juries believe it. Because most jurors aren't computer scientists. Most don't know how source code works. And in that gap of knowledge, a single number can eclipse all reasonable doubt. But here's what jurors never see. They don't see that different software can take the same DNA sample and reach different results. They don't see that TrueAllele and STRMix, tested on the same cases, have contradicted each other. They don't see that in some studies, the programs produced wildly inflated probabilities of guilt. And they don't see the programming errors buried deep inside the code. Errors that could mean the difference between freedom and a life sentence. Errors the defense isn't allowed to uncover. It makes you wonder, if you were on a jury, would you trust a guilty verdict from a computer program you weren't allowed to understand? Would you send someone to prison or even death row because an algorithm told you to? That is the terrifying seduction of numbers. The courtroom transforms statistics into truth, and truth into punishment. But one defense team refused to be hypnotized. They demanded to see the code. And what happened next exposed the lengths to which prosecutors and corporations would go to protect the black box. Because if the code was revealed, the entire system could collapse. Every courtroom battle begins with emotion. And in case after case, defense lawyers began filing the same request. We demand access to the source code, not the output, not the probability scores, the actual code that generates them. Because without seeing the instructions written line by line, how could anyone know the machine wasn't flawed? How could a man's freedom hinge on an algorithm kept secret by its creators? This wasn't just about curiosity. It was about due process. The Constitution guarantees the right to confront evidence, to test it, to challenge it. But with software like TrueAllele and STRMix, prosecutors pushed back. Hard. They argued the code was proprietary, intellectual property, that revealing it would be like stealing Coca-Cola's recipe. And judges listened. In courtrooms from California to New York, defense teams were told, no, you cannot see the code, even when someone's life was on the line. Instead, Jurors heard prosecutors repeat the same refrain. The computer is objective. The computer doesn't lie. But behind that refrain, cracks were already forming. In 2015, a Brooklyn case became a flashpoint. A man faced prison based on software analysis of DNA from a gun. His lawyers demanded the code. The prosecution refused. The judge sided with them, and the jury convicted. But outside the courtroom, whispers began spreading. Independent scientists warned that black box algorithms were not infallible. That DNA mixtures were messy, complex, and even the best software struggled to interpret them consistently. The more complicated the sample, the less reliable the math. Then, in 2016, the whispers became a storm. A New York forensic lab quietly suspended use of its proprietary DNA software after internal reviews flagged troubling inconsistencies. Cases that once seemed airtight suddenly looked questionable. How many convictions, people asked, were built on a foundation of code no one was allowed to check? But the fight wasn't over. Defense lawyers across the country filed new motions, new appeals, demanding transparency. And with each filing, the stakes grew higher. Because if just one judge ordered the release of the code, the illusion of perfection could shatter. The black box would be forced open, and the public might see the truth, that men and women were sitting in prison, condemned by algorithms that might not even work. It was a battle between two visions of justice. One that valued secrecy in the name of protection, and one that demanded transparency no matter the cost. And at the heart of it all, real human lives. Innocence Uncovered has investigated many wrongful convictions. But here, the injustice isn't just in the verdicts. It's in the system's refusal to let the truth be tested. In 2016, in a Brooklyn courtroom, a case unfolded that would test the very heart of computational forensics. The defendant, a man accused of possessing a gun. The evidence, DNA recovered from the weapon's surface. Not a clean fingerprint, not a clear strand of hair, but a mixture, multiple contributors, smeared and partial. The kind of evidence where traditional methods often fail. That's when prosecutors called in TrueAllele. Cybergenetics, the private company behind TrueAllele, promised jurors certainty. The program ran its calculations. It compared patterns. It churned probabilities. And it produced a simple, devastating number. The chance that this DNA matched the defendant was billions to one. Billions. To the jury, it sounded like divine math. But the defense wasn't buying it. The defense team stood up and made a bold demand. Show us the source code. If you want us to accept the verdict of this machine, then we need to see how the machine works. They weren't asking for trade secrets to get rich. They were asking for due process. Because what if the program mishandled low-level DNA? What if it misread the mixture? What if there was a bug buried deep inside the code? The truth was locked away in that algorithm. But Cybergenetics refused. The company called its code a trade secret. Prosecutors backed them up, arguing that exposing the algorithm would compromise the business. And the judge agreed. The defense was denied. The code would remain sealed. The jury never heard a word about the program's secrecy. Instead, they were told, the science is sound. Trust the computer. And once again, a guilty verdict followed. But here's the twist. Even as courts were shielding the code, scientists were uncovering troubling flaws in similar software. In Washington, D.C., researchers tested STRMix, another proprietary DNA program. And they found that when the DNA samples got too complex, too many contributors, too many smudges, the software could spit out results that were flat out wrong. False inclusions, wrong matches, people tied to evidence they never touched. And yet, those same results were being presented in courtrooms as unshakable proof. If you were a juror sitting in that Brooklyn trial, what would you have done? Would you convict a man based on the word of a machine you weren't allowed to understand? And if you were the defendant, how could you fight an accuser you weren't even allowed to face? The Brooklyn case wasn't just one trial. It was a blueprint. Across the United States, defense attorneys kept demanding transparency, and time after time, they were told no. The black box remained closed. But that resistance only fueled suspicion. Because if the code was flawless, if the science was sound, then why fight so hard to keep it hidden? And then, finally, one court broke ranks. A judge ordered the release of a DNA program's source code. And what experts found inside would shake the foundations of forensic science. For years, the algorithms behind DNA analysis had been untouchable, sealed away behind the iron curtain of trade secrets. But in 2019, in upstate New York, something extraordinary happened. For the first time, a judge ordered prosecutors to hand over the source code of a DNA program called STRMix. The defense finally had its chance to peek behind the curtain. The code was handed to a team of independent experts, computer scientists, bioinformaticians, people fluent in both DNA and algorithms. They dug deep. They ran simulations. They stress-tested the software. And what they uncovered was chilling. They found bugs. Not one, not two, but hundreds of errors in the code. Some bugs caused the program to crash mid-analysis. Others skewed probability estimates in ways that could dramatically overstate confidence in a match. And some errors went completely undocumented, hidden inside tens of thousands of lines of code. These weren't just typos. They were flaws with life and death consequences. And yet, prosecutors had been introducing STRMix results in courts across the country for years, assuring juries it was flawless. They told jurors it was validated. They told judges it was scientifically reliable. They told the public it was justice. But what they didn't say, what they couldn't say, was that the very code producing those verdicts was unstable. Imagine being one of those defendants. You sit in the courtroom. You hear the prosecutor say the probability is 1 in a trillion. And you think, what chance do I have against those odds? But you don't know that the trillion might really be 1,000,000, or 1,000, or worse, that the number itself was corrupted by a bug. Your freedom decided not by truth, but by a glitch. If this sounds like science fiction, it isn't. In fact, a 2015 internal STRMix report, which only became public years later, admitted that the software had already produced misleading results in at least 60 cases worldwide. 60 lives, 60 courtrooms, 60 verdicts built on sand. And still, the system marched forward. If you were a judge, would you allow a conviction to stand after learning the software had hidden bugs? Or would you throw the evidence out entirely? But here's where the story gets darker. Even after experts exposed the flaws, even after defense teams waved red flags, the companies behind these programs fought harder. Instead of admitting error, they doubled down. They hired lawyers. They issued press releases. They told the courts, these bugs don't change the outcomes. But the truth was, no one could really know. Because even as one courtroom cracked the box open, most judges across America were still keeping it sealed shut. The black box wasn't just an algorithm anymore. It had become a fortress, guarded by corporations, protected by prosecutors, and endorsed by a justice system that seemed to care more about convictions than about truth. But here's the part that no one saw coming. Because when defense attorneys finally got a look inside another program, TrueAllele, the secrets they uncovered didn't just reveal bad science. They revealed a strategy, a business model, a system where profit came first and justice came last. At the heart of the black box wasn't just science. It was money. The most famous DNA algorithm in America is called TrueAllele, created by a company named Cybergenetics. And according to its founder, Dr. Mark Perlin, TrueAllele was designed to solve the most complicated DNA mixtures, the kind that used to confuse human analysts. On the surface, it looked like a revolutionary tool. But beneath the surface, it was also a business empire. Every time prosecutors want to use TrueAllele, they pay Cybergenetics a fee. Every time a conviction is secured, the software's reputation and its market value grows. The result? An incentive system where every guilty verdict becomes an advertisement for the product. And the more prosecutors win, the more cybergenetics profits. But what happens when the defense asks for transparency? When an innocent person's life is on the line, and their attorney says, "We want to see the source code," the answer is always the same: no. Cybergenetics has spent years in courtrooms across the country fighting to keep TrueAllele's code a trade secret. Judges have heard the pleas of defendants on trial for their lives. And yet, time and time again, they've sided with the company, ruling that intellectual property was more important than human liberty. Let that sink in. The system that decides whether you spend your life in a prison cell is protected like a corporate recipe for Coca-Cola. This is not about science anymore. It's about control. Because if the code were revealed, it wouldn't just expose bugs. It could expose something worse. The possibility that thousands of convictions rest on faulty math. And for cybergenetics, that would mean lawsuits, lost contracts, ruined credibility. For prosecutors, it would mean retrials, overturned verdicts, careers in flames. So they fight transparency not because it's impossible, but because it's dangerous. Dangerous to their bottom line. Dangerous to their reputations. Dangerous to the very myth of infallible justice. If you were facing prison for life, would you trust your future to a company that refuses to show its work? Should trade secrets ever outweigh a defendant's right to a fair trial? In one Pennsylvania case, a man named Clinton Gessner begged to see the TrueAllele code that labeled him guilty. The judge refused. The jury never knew. And Gessner was convicted. But he isn't alone. Across the United States, from California to Virginia, defense teams have made the same request and been met with the same cold response: access denied. This is the business of conviction. Corporations sell software. Prosecutors buy results. Judges protect the pipeline. And defendants? They are the raw material, the input, the product that keeps the machine turning. But here's the chilling truth. Even when mistakes are caught, even when bugs are exposed, even when real lives are ruined, the system doesn't stop. Because once you treat justice as a business, innocence becomes bad for business. But the story doesn't end in sealed courtrooms. Because when journalists and independent scientists began digging into these algorithms themselves, they uncovered something even darker. Not just errors, not just trade secrets, but the terrifying reality that these programs weren't even tested the way real science demands. They were never built to protect the innocent. They were built to secure convictions. For years, cybergenetics insisted that TrueAllele was flawless. Prosecutors treated it like a silver bullet. Judges protected it as if it were sacred. But when independent scientists and journalists began to peel back the layers, they found something prosecutors never told the jury. The code wasn't perfect. The science wasn't absolute. And the cracks were already showing. A joint investigation by journalists and legal scholars revealed that TrueAllele and STRMix, the two most widely used DNA algorithms, had both been implicated in serious errors. In one case, STRMix miscalculated probabilities in thousands of DNA samples. The company had to issue a correction, but by then, verdicts had already been delivered. In TrueAllele, its defenders boasted that it had never made a mistake. But that was only because the code was locked away, shielded from scrutiny. No one outside the company could check their work. No one could run the numbers themselves. And when defense experts asked for access, they were told, "Trust us." Trust. In a criminal justice system that has a track record of convicting the innocent. Trust when someone's life, freedom, and future were on the line. This wasn't science. It was faith. In 2015, researchers in New Zealand revealed that STRMix had miscalculated DNA probabilities in over 60 cases. The software had to be patched, but the convictions? Most remained untouched. And in 2020, a federal court heard testimony from computer scientists who reviewed forensic algorithms. Their conclusion was chilling. Without open source validation, there was no way to guarantee these programs were reliable. One expert put it plainly: if you can't see the code, you can't see the truth. But prosecutors didn't want the truth, because truth could unravel their wins. Truth could cast doubt on years of convictions. So instead, they doubled down. They told juries that the algorithms were airtight. They told judges that transparency was unnecessary. They told the public nothing at all. Would you accept a guilty verdict if the evidence came from a program you weren't allowed to question? Or should every defendant have the right to challenge the code that decides their fate? Behind every error was a name, a face, a life. People like George Parole, convicted in Massachusetts partly because of shaky DNA mixture evidence. It took decades for experts to reveal that the science used against him was deeply flawed. By then, he had spent more than 30 years in prison. How many more sit in cells today, with verdicts built not on certainty, but on the silent word of an algorithm? This is the danger of the black box. When mistakes happen in the light, they can be fixed. When mistakes happen in the dark, they multiply. And in the world of computational forensics, the dark isn't an accident. It's the design. But the most shocking revelation was still ahead. Because in one courtroom, for the first time, a defense team fought hard enough and long enough to crack open the black box. And what they found inside wasn't the promise of perfect science. It was the proof that this entire system was built on something far more dangerous. Not certainty, not truth, but probability dressed up as destiny. Courtrooms have always been theaters of truth, or at least, that's what we want to believe. But when defense attorneys began to question computational forensics, they weren't just challenging evidence. They were challenging the entire stage itself. Imagine this. You're defending a client accused of murder. The state claims the DNA found at the crime scene is a match. But when you ask, how exactly did the software reach that conclusion? The prosecutor says, that's a trade secret. That's not hypothetical. It's the reality in cases across the United States. In People versus Chubbs, a California murder trial, the defense demanded access to the TrueAllele source code. The software was the linchpin of the prosecution's case. But Cybergenetics argued disclosure would endanger their intellectual property. The judge sided with the company. The defense never got the code. The verdict stood. This wasn't an isolated incident. From Pennsylvania to California, Ohio to New York, courts repeatedly ruled against defendants who asked for transparency. Judges told them that trade secrets outweighed due process. Think about that for a moment. The right to a fair trial weighed against a corporation's profit margin, and justice lost. Defense experts argue that without access to the source code, errors can't be detected, biases can't be uncovered, and innocent people can't defend themselves. But prosecutors? They love the black box. It gives them certainty in the eyes of a jury, without the risk of cross-examination exposing weaknesses. And yet, in a few rare cases, cracks began to form. In New York, a defense team managed to persuade a judge to allow limited inspection of STRMix code. What they discovered shocked them. Logic errors and miscalculations that could swing results by orders of magnitude. Mistakes that could mean the difference between innocence and life in prison. But here's the catch. Those findings were sealed. The public never got to see them, and the system went right back to business as usual. This wasn't just a scientific debate. It was a war of values. Do we protect corporate secrets? Or do we protect constitutional rights? In courtroom after courtroom, the answer was clear. And it wasn't justice. If you were a juror, would you accept a computer's guilty verdict without knowing how it was calculated? Or would you demand transparency before sending someone to prison? The battles over access revealed something deeper. That our justice system wasn't just complicit. It was actively choosing to side with secrecy. Judges didn't want to risk overturning old convictions. Prosecutors didn't want to lose their prized evidence. And corporations didn't want to lose their golden goose. Everyone had something to protect. Everyone, that is, except the defendant. And so the black box remained closed. But then, in one case, against all odds, defense attorneys finally pushed hard enough, long enough, and a tiny sliver of light broke through. For the first time, the code was dragged, reluctantly, into the open. And what they found inside would shake the very foundation of forensic science. Because the black box wasn't just hiding trade secrets. It was hiding errors. It was hiding bias. And most damning of all, it was hiding the fact that what prosecutors called science was often nothing more than an illusion of certainty. Up to now, it might all feel abstract: algorithms, trade secrets, courtroom battles. But behind every data point is a human being. And one of them was John Kokuk. In 2015, Kokuk was accused of a violent crime in Pennsylvania. The evidence against him wasn't an eyewitness. It wasn't fingerprints. It wasn't even traditional DNA testing. It was the TrueAllele software. The program claimed his DNA was present in a complex mixture from the crime scene. The jury believed it. Kokuk was sentenced to life in prison. But here's what jurors never knew. Defense attorneys begged for access to the algorithm that made that call. They argued that without transparency, the so-called match was meaningless. The court said no. Trade secrets came first. So the jury never heard about error rates or the possibility of a false match. They only heard certainty. And certainty, in a courtroom, is deadly. Kokuk has spent years fighting to appeal his conviction. His attorneys insist that the software may have exaggerated the strength of the DNA evidence. But without access to the code, proving that claim is nearly impossible. The system has trapped him in a paradox. You need the source code to prove your innocence. But you can't see the source code unless you've already proven your innocence. This wasn't a one-off. Across the country, dozens of people have been convicted by software they weren't allowed to question. Imagine being told, "Trust the computer. It knows better than you," and then spending decades in a cell because of it. But here's the kicker. Independent scientists have reviewed some of these algorithms when judges allowed even a peek behind the curtain. And what they found should terrify you. In one case, the software misread tiny alleles as full DNA contributors. In another, it failed to account for population substructure, skewing probabilities. Even small miscalculations could change the outcome from 1 in a billion to 1 in 100. That's not certainty. That's a coin flip with someone's life on the line. For Kokuk and others like him, justice isn't just delayed. It's denied. Because the truth isn't locked in a lab somewhere. It's locked in a corporate server. And until it's opened, innocent people remain caged. But then, in a rare twist, one defense team refused to back down. They pushed harder, appealed higher, and demanded access not just to the evidence, but to the engine behind it. And in a landmark decision, they finally cracked the black box. What they uncovered inside was worse than anyone expected. Errors, assumptions, and flaws so basic, they threatened to unravel convictions across the country. For the first time, the public began to see that forensic certainty wasn't science at all. It was a house of cards, built on code no one was allowed to question. Because if algorithms could convict an innocent man like John Kokuk, how many others were already sitting in cells, waiting for their own code to be exposed? Should private corporations be allowed to hide behind trade secrets when someone's life is at stake? Or should transparency always come first in a courtroom? For years, defense attorneys fought an uphill battle against DNA software giants like Cybergenetics. Every motion was denied. Every request for transparency crushed by the phrase, "trade secrets." It seemed impenetrable, until one defense team finally found a crack in the wall. In New York, a man named Glenn Ford stood trial for a violent crime. The prosecution's case rested heavily on results from STRMix, a competing DNA algorithm. The defense argued that without access to the program's source code, they couldn't possibly verify whether the match was reliable. This time, the judge agreed. For the first time, defense experts were allowed to look behind the curtain, to read the very lines of code that had declared guilt. What they found wasn't a miracle of modern science. It was a mess. The source code contained serious errors, glitches in how the program interpreted DNA peaks, flaws in how it calculated probabilities, even hard-coded assumptions that leaned toward guilt. This wasn't an impartial machine. This was software written by humans who made mistakes. Mistakes with consequences measured in years of stolen freedom. One defense expert described it bluntly. These algorithms can exaggerate certainty. A probability that should be 1 in May 10th be presented as 1 in 10,000. In a courtroom, that shift is everything. It turns reasonable doubt into scientific proof. It turns an innocent person into a felon. When the flaws in STRMix were revealed, prosecutors scrambled to contain the damage. They argued the errors didn't matter. They insisted the overall reliability of the software was still intact. But defense attorneys knew better, and jurors who heard about the mistakes began asking their own questions. If the software was wrong here, how many other cases were compromised? The revelation sent shockwaves. Across the country, defense lawyers filed motions demanding similar access to TrueAllele, Cybergenetics' flagship program. If STRMix was flawed, why should anyone trust its rival? What would TrueAllele's code reveal if it were ever exposed? And that's when the corporations doubled down. Instead of acknowledging error, Cybergenetics fought harder than ever to protect its code. They argued that revealing it would destroy their business. They claimed competitors could steal their intellectual property. But behind the legal jargon, one truth rang louder than all. Profits were being placed above justice. And while corporations protected their bottom line, human beings sat in prison cells. Innocent or guilty, they had no way to challenge the evidence that put them there. No way to test the machine that decided their fate. It was Kafkaesque justice. You're told the evidence is infallible. You're told you can't question it. And when you try, the door slams shut in your face. For defendants like John Kokuk, for countless others whose names will never make headlines, the message was clear. You're not on trial against the state. You're not even on trial against your accuser. You're on trial against a black box. And you're not allowed to look inside. But in one extraordinary twist, a team of independent computer scientists managed to dig deeper. Not just into STRMix, but into other forensic algorithms. What they found was shocking. Hard-coded shortcuts, simplified math that ignored rare genetic markers, and even coding bugs that produced different results for the same DNA sample, depending on the day it was analyzed. This wasn't justice. This was chaos disguised as certainty. And yet, courts continued to admit this evidence. Prosecutors kept calling it the gold standard. Judges kept blocking transparency. Why? Because once the public truly understood what was inside the black box, the entire system could collapse. If a judge told you, the computer says guilty, would you believe it, or would you demand to see the code? It should have forced prosecutors to pause, judges to reconsider, lawmakers to demand transparency. But that's not what happened. Instead, the justice system did something far more chilling. It defended the black box. When defense attorneys filed motions for access to TrueAllele's source code, prosecutors fought back with fury. They argued disclosure would harm the company's profits. They claimed that trade secrets deserved greater protection than a defendant's right to confront the evidence used to imprison them. And shockingly, judges agreed. In ruling after ruling, courts sided with the corporations. They declared that the intellectual property of cybergenetics was more valuable than the liberty of the accused. Think about that. In America, your freedom can be taken away by evidence you are legally forbidden to question. In one case out of Pennsylvania, defense attorneys begged for the source code that had declared their client guilty. The judge's response? He admitted the code might have flaws, but ruled that even if it did, the defendant had no right to see it. The court essentially said, "We'd rather risk wrongful convictions than challenge the machine." Prosecutors seized on this protection. In closing arguments, they held up algorithmic results like Holy Scripture. The computer doesn't lie, they told juries. This is science. But here's the truth they buried. Science is not a black box. Real science is open, tested, and transparent. This wasn't science. This was faith disguised as fact. And jurors, ordinary people unfamiliar with probability math or DNA analysis, often believed them. When they heard numbers like 1 in 5 billion, it felt absolute. It felt like truth. They didn't know those numbers came from code riddled with assumptions, shortcuts, and bugs. In some states, prosecutors went even further. They lobbied lawmakers to codify the use of these algorithms into law, to make it nearly impossible for defendants to challenge them in court. It was the ultimate shield. The black box would not only be protected by judges, it would be enshrined by legislators. At that point, the algorithm wasn't just a tool of justice. It had become a weapon of the state, and prosecutors knew exactly what they were doing. For every motion they blocked, every objection they raised, every appeal they crushed, one question lingered like smoke in the courtroom. Were they protecting justice or protecting their convictions? Because make no mistake, prosecutors aren't judged by how many innocent people they protect. They're judged by win rates, by how many convictions they secure. And an algorithm that juries trust without question? That's the perfect weapon for a career prosecutor. This wasn't negligence. This was strategy, a calculated decision to prioritize victory over truth. And judges, the supposed guardians of fairness, went along with it. They wrapped the black box in a robe of legitimacy, assuring the public it was reliable, even when the cracks were already visible. But what happens when the cracks grow too big to hide? When the algorithm doesn't just convict the guilty, but destroys the lives of the innocent? That's when the human cost of this black box would become impossible to ignore. If you were on trial, would you rather face flawed human testimony you can cross-examine, or a machine you're not allowed to question? For years, we've talked about algorithms, trade secrets, and probabilities. But behind every number is a name. Behind every conviction, a life. And for some, the black box didn't just decide the outcome of a case. It decided their future. Take the case of Christopher Vaughn. In 2012, Vaughn was accused of a brutal crime, the murder of his family. Prosecutors leaned heavily on DNA software analysis to argue his guilt, despite contradictory physical evidence. The algorithm spat out a number, billions to one, that the DNA was his. Jurors didn't need to understand it. The number was enough. And Vaughn, he's still serving life, still fighting for access to the code that put him away. Then there's George Parole, a Massachusetts man accused of a 1985 rape. The only evidence tying him to the crime was hair, reanalyzed decades later with TrueAllele software. The algorithm said the match was astronomical. A jury believed it, and Parole spent 30 years in prison before experts finally challenged the reliability of the evidence. 30 years. Gone. Think about it. Would those jurors have convicted if they'd known the code was flawed? Would they have reached the same verdict if they'd been told? You can't question the evidence, you just have to trust it? Because that's exactly what happened. They were asked to believe in a machine, not in proof. And these aren't isolated stories. Across the United States, from California to Pennsylvania, from Ohio to New York, defendants have faced the same impossible dilemma. How do you fight an accuser you cannot see? How do you cross-examine an algorithm? One defense attorney described it this way. It's like putting a black hood over the witness's head. You're told the testimony is flawless, but you're not allowed to check. And for the accused, the stakes couldn't be higher. Freedom, family, their very lives. The human algorithm isn't the software. It's the system itself. Prosecutors, judges, corporations, all working in concert. The machine doesn't put people in prison. People do, but the machine gives them cover. It gives them numbers that sound like truth. It gives them a way to win without doubt. And that's why men and women like Vaughn and Parole are still fighting today, not just against their convictions, but against an enemy they're not even allowed to see. So what happens when the truth about these black boxes becomes undeniable? When the cracks in the code, the bugs, the hidden errors are finally exposed to daylight. Because that moment is coming. And when it does, it won't just unravel one case. It could unravel thousands. If you were on a jury, would you ever trust a guilty verdict based only on a number from a machine you couldn't question? Why or why not? We began with a miracle, a machine that could read the unreadable, a program that promised certainty in a courtroom built on doubt. But now, that miracle feels more like a curse. Across America, defendants are serving decades, even life sentences, based on numbers generated by algorithms they were never allowed to question. Corporations like Cybergenetics, the creators of TrueAllele, have argued their source code is a trade secret. Judges, prosecutors, entire justice systems have agreed. And so the black box remains sealed, impenetrable, untouchable. But here's the truth. No algorithm is infallible. Every line of code is written by humans, and humans make mistakes. In fact, when researchers in Australia gained rare access to STRMix, they discovered coding errors that had gone unnoticed for years. Errors that affected hundreds of cases. Think about that. Lives decided by bugs. And yet, even when evidence of flaws comes to light, courts resist reopening cases. Prosecutors argue that finality matters more than truth. Finality, as if justice is just a paperwork deadline. As if an innocent person rotting in a cell is less important than protecting the credibility of a system built on secrecy. And here's the most chilling part. DNA software is just the beginning. Already, algorithms are being used in bail hearings, in sentencing decisions, in predictive policing. The same black box logic that sent men like George Parole and Christopher Vaughn to prison is now being used to decide who gets released, who gets punished, who gets watched before they've even committed a crime. This isn't just about DNA anymore. It's about the future of freedom itself. Ask yourself, can you defend yourself against an accuser you cannot see? Can you question a witness that has no face, no name, no conscience? Because that's where we are heading. A justice system where your fate isn't decided by evidence, but by an algorithm you'll never understand. And what happens when the next error is discovered? When the next black box is cracked open and the truth comes spilling out? It won't just unravel one case. It could unravel thousands. This is the reckoning. This is the danger of black box justice. And it's why we do what we do. Because if we don't shine a light on these hidden systems, more lives will be stolen, not by guns, not by gangs, not even by corrupt cops, but by code. Subscribe to Innocence Uncovered. We expose the corrupt systems and the secret evidence that destroy innocent lives. And if you want to know how prosecutors are criminalizing miscarriages, watch our exposé on Brittany What's Next. Because the digital prison is already being built. The question is, will we let it lock us in? If you were accused of a crime, would you trust your fate to a machine whose code you weren't allowed to see? Why or why not?